While Republicans work to figure out who the next speaker is going to be, the Biden administration is trying to censor American citizens ahead of the 2024 presidential election. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit this week ruled that a key cybersecurity defense agency probably violated the First Amendment in its efforts to coordinate with Silicon Valley to, quote, protect elections from online hoaxes. The Washington Post reporting this week it's a decision that could have sweeping implications for government efforts to secure the vote in 2024. Barf. The Washington Post write-up of this is awful. The reality here is that the Biden administration is being put in check by the Fifth Circuit from censoring American citizens during the election. For more on this, we bring in Eric Schmitt now. He's the former attorney general in Missouri and is responsible for bringing this lawsuit. He's now a U.S. senator from the state of Missouri. Sir, good to have you with us.
Great to be with you, Vince.
This seems like a big victory this week in an ongoing court saga.
It is. I mean, I think that in some ways, in conservative circles, it's gotten some attention. The mainstream media, of course, has completely ignored this. But the truth of the matter is this is the most important free speech case in the history of the country because it deals with, I mean, this isn't just big tech by itself. This is, the case has been made and it has been found at the district court level and not the circuit court level that big government, the federal government with all of its power and authority, colluded with, corroborated with, and coerced big tech, some of the biggest companies in the history of the world, to censor Americans. Millions of posts, whether it was the lab leak theory, whether it was masking, whether it was on the vaccine, whether it was on the Hunter Biden laptop story, you name it, they were involved in censoring speech. And of course, the government doesn't get to do that, but they also don't get to outsource that to third parties like big tech. And so It's a big case, and it's ongoing, that's for sure. Ultimately, it'll end up at the Supreme Court, I'm sure, Vince.
I did see that the Biden administration, in its court filings, they said something like, well, when the FBI asks for Americans to be censored, we're only successful 50% of the time. Which is like, wait a second. That's insane. Like, imagine if you had the power as an individual to just shut down 50% of all speech that you saw, like all over the place. That's crazy.
It's nuts. And you know, whenever you see them protecting us from disinformation and misinformation, that basically means conservative speech, right? That they don't like. And by the way, the remedy for that is more information, right? If you disagree with a point of view or you think it's factually incorrect, you say, listen, here's why. You don't take it down. The government doesn't get to do that. You know, I'm 48 years old, so I'm sort of, I guess, Gen X. You know, growing up, liberals at least believed in free speech. That is no longer the case, Vince. It's actually shocking the lengths that they'll go for this kind of power and control. And so now they're using the government along with big tech to censor. We had the chance to take not only Anthony Fauci's deposition when I was Attorney General, but also Elvis Chan, who was the FBI agent in the Northern District of California with the big tech companies, who told them on the eve of the election, they were having weekly censorship meetings, was telling them, even though the FBI had the laptop from November of 2019, told them, look out for this Russian hack and leak operation. And in a sworn affidavit, Yoel Roth, who was the Twitter guy, said he specifically mentioned Hunter Biden. So they were setting the stage even in 2020. Of course, they get into office. Any disagreement with the regime's narrative on masks or vaccines they censored, it's widespread. And even the judge notes this is Orwellian. And then what did they do, Vince? They have a disinformation governance board. I mean, this is nuts. It's out of a novel.
So the tech companies, obviously they're ideologically in line with the government here. So that plays a role in this. But additionally, is it your impression, it certainly is mine, reading through some of the court filings and some of the testimony, that the tech companies were nervous about ever rejecting the government's requests for censorship?
That's right. And one of the linchpins here is that in order, I mean, you know, these big tech companies willingly, you look at their donations from the employees inside, or when people lost their minds when Elon Musk bought Twitter, clearly that's their bent. However, the hook here in this case, and what's very important, is that the government threatened. They threatened legal action. They threatened antitrust investigations. They threatened these companies would lose their Section 230 protections if they didn't censor more. So that's a big part of the case. So although they may do some of this willingly, we have text messages and emails going back and forth saying, hey, this is a problem, take it down, and a response saying, you know, we did it, what else can we do? And you know, intermixed with all of that are threats coming from the podium at the press secretary, threats coming from people inside of the White House saying, do this or else. I think one of the judges notes in the Fifth Circuit opinion was, that's a nice big tech company you have there, isn't it? Wouldn't it be a shame if something happened to it, right? That's essentially what they were doing, and
Yes.
you don't get to do that. And so anyway.
So it's interesting that they would even rely on Section 230. This is the Communications Decency Act, correct? Which has a very Orwellian name for what it's worth, communications decency. But regardless, so that you have a protection from lawsuits if you are merely a platform and not a publisher of information. You're not making editorial judgments about what appears on your platform. You're just allowing people to communicate. So obviously that kind of thing, immunity from lawsuits, is a good way to protect an environment where free speech is proliferating. But what the government appears to be doing here is forcing these companies to make editorial judgments. You will censor certain lines of communication. You will elevate others. And so how could they lose their Section 230 protections? They're forcing them to do this.
Right. Well, they were saying you're going to lose your special legal protections if you don't do what we want you to do, which is to censor speech. I've got legislation now in the Senate. Obviously, as Attorney General, this is a seminal case that does a couple of things. On the public side, if the government is found to be violating your First Amendment rights, we've got legislation that would allow individuals to sue individual government actors for those First Amendment violations. Instead of just one Attorney General bringing these causes of action to stop this nonsense, we need an army of citizens being able to sue some bureaucrat. And that will be, by the way, a disincentive for the government to continue to do this. On the private side, the reason why they should lose their Section 230 protections isn't because they're censoring. It should be if they're censoring, not because they're not censoring, right? So if it's found that a big tech company is violating your First Amendment rights, that's why they ought to lose their Section 230 protections. But the government was using a different way to get them to censor, which is, if you think about that, again, you just keep coming back to the sort of Orwellian, dystopian world that I'm not sure people thought we would be in a few years ago, but that's where we're at, and we got to stop it.
Well, these companies, they in many ways control the public square now. 90% of all search is done through Google, and so that affects the way that the average citizen views the world and how to consider what to vote for and who should be in power. And that's what we do as American citizens. If they're engaged in viewpoint discrimination with that monopoly power, then they're not a platform. They're a publisher.
That's exactly right. So you don't get the protection if you're making those kinds of editorial decisions. Because if you think about it, when that law came into effect in 1996, the idea was that the internet would sort of democratize information, right? You'd have more information. People could have their points of view. It would be in the virtual town square. What has happened now is, if that's not the case, and they're making editorial decisions, they're saying you can say this and you can't say this. It no longer fits in the construct that it was intended, right, to give this sort of broad immunity. So you got to pick, right? You're either going to be an open platform where you allow free speech, or you're going to be a publisher and you don't have the Section 230 protections. I think that's the right way to look at this. But no matter how you look at it in the private sphere, one thing is clear: the government has no business telling you what you can say, what you can hear, what you can think. It's really one of the founding principles of the country, right? It's this pressure release valve for us to be able to speak our minds, not just in the town square, but also in the virtual town square as well.
So as this case works its way up to the United States Supreme Court, it does seem pretty important in terms of establishing what the lines are, because the government has clearly been using private industry to do what it can't do directly.
Right, and if you look at the drumbeat of some of the global elites, say at the World Economic Forum or at the United Nations, you hear this sort of undertone of, we have to make sure we're controlling misinformation and disinformation. Listen, I'm all for the truth. The difference is individuals get to decide what that is, right? The government doesn't get to decide what that is. So we've got to be pretty vigilant here. This case is a big part of it, but this is going to continue as everybody's online more, as AI plays a more significant role in synthesizing information. We've got to keep an eye out, because you've got government agencies who think they know better than everyone else, and we've got to make sure we disrupt that. The lawsuit's a piece of it. Litigation's a piece of it. And again, like I said, having individual citizens being able to bring these causes of actions against bureaucrats, I think, would be a nice disincentive as well.
For sure. There was supposed to be a hearing today in the House Judiciary Committee that involved a man you just mentioned a few minutes ago, FBI agent Elvis Chan. Elvis Chan is the agent, for people who may not remember, who was behind so much of this tech censorship, allegedly. He was the one who was pressuring places like Twitter and Facebook to not publish the Hunter Biden story, in fact, to censor it. He was supposed to testify today before House Judiciary, but did not. In fact, when he showed up, He showed up with a Biden administration handler who was supposed to oversee his testimony. The committee said that person is not allowed in the room. And, well, Elvis has left the building. Elvis Chan did not go to that hearing today. What do you make of that the Biden administration wanted to lord over his testimony?
I think that what you're probably seeing is just like when Merrick Garland testified in front of that committee just a couple of weeks ago. If you notice, his testimony was very reserved about, sort of what he knew about targeting political enemies, going after, Catholics, going after pro-lifers, going after parents. I think, given the subpoena power that the House has, given the impeachment inquiry, there's a lot of information they can get here. So I think they're worried about a perjury, I think, issue right now. That's what it tells me. But we have his deposition. One of the reasons why that deposition was so important when we took it in the Moby Biden case, it's a baseline, right? And so information that comes out afterwards now can be challenged or can challenge his whatever new testimony he might have or whatever denials he had at the time. This is also true, by the way, with Anthony Fauci. In my view, it's just a matter of time, but he ought to be brought before that committee and other committees. And certainly if Republicans had the gavels in the Senate, this would already have happened, I believe. But I think this is an important thing to watch because the havoc that was wreaked by Anthony Fauci in covering his tracks on the funding of the Wuhan lab, and then, trying to smear anyone who talked about that theory or his involvement. That's part of this case, too. So it's the sort of wall of lies that they built over a period of months and years is going to come crashing down. And I'm glad Jim Jordan and others are pursuing this aggressively.
Senator Eric Schmitt, finally, we are now just less than 3 months away from 2024 and truly to be in the heat of the presidential election. Will we be able to ensure that free speech can prevail going into and through this next campaign?
I hope so. We understand what's at stake here. We saw what happened in 2020. The laptop story is the most glaring example of this, right? They did not want that story to come out. The FBI helped poison the well before. You had Anthony Blinken round up all these intelligence agency hacks, sign a letter saying that's nonsense. They did everything they could to keep that away from the American people, and we're pretty successful at it. I think there's lessons learned there. One thing that I think we should all take away from is we have to fight back. We can never back down from this. The First Amendment is worth fighting for. Our elections are worth fighting for. So I'm going to remain vigilant. I know a lot of people are too. It's just really important. And I think that this election, 2024, really determines sort of the trajectory of our republic. And we're not talking about events like marginal tax rates. We're talking about Democrats want to add states to the union, obliterating people's First Amendment rights, federalizing elections, and adding,
Yes.
justices to the Supreme Court. So there's a lot on the line.
Yeah, and if you can control what people see, you can control their minds, and that's how you rig an election, truly. Senator, good to have you with us today. Senator Eric Schmitt from Missouri. Thank you, sir.
Anytime, Vince. Take care.
All right.